My name is Alger Chabatoni, and let me start by explaining the Alger, because people have wondered about that name for a long, long time. I've wondered about it myself, especially combined with a very Italian last name. As I understand it, I had an older brother, and it turns out that my father turned over the naming of me to my brother, and my brother had been reading the very famous series of books. They used to call them boy books because they were all about boys succeeding, starting with nothing and then all of a sudden ending up very successfully, written by a man by the name of Horatio Alger. And my brother took the Alger from Horatio Alger, and that's how I got this name, which has been a bit of a problem for me. And for that reason, I have used Al. And most people here in the church, most people that I grew up with, most people I went to school with, and I worked with, all called me Al. Anyway, yes, I was born in 1934, the depth of the Depression, and my parents, who were immigrants, and I'm very proud of that fact, my parents were immigrants from Italy, both came to this country as children, and I had an older brother, an older sister, and I was an afterthought, if we want to put it that way. I don't know what else we can call it. I grew up in a little Italy in Trenton, New Jersey, a very, very Italian neighborhood, which is no longer that way, as most of them are. Even our own North Beach here in San Francisco isn't as Italian as it was when I first got to San Francisco. My father had come to this country and actually was apprenticed to an uncle who was a barber. And my earliest remembrances were of sitting in the barber chair in my father's barber shop, which was the front room of the house that we lived in. My parents and I, after I graduated high school, motored to Southern California to be with that older sister and her husband, who had already come to the Arcadia area of Southern California outside of Pasadena. She had not been well in that cold, damp New Jersey winter, and a doctor had recommended that she go to a warmer, drier climate. So they trooped out to Southern California. My sister was already here. She missed her parents, and she really, really pushed to have us come out. And so after I graduated high school, as I said, we motored out. I was ready for college. I started in a junior college, Pasadena City College. And then I went on and got my degree from Pomona College in Claremont. One of the best moves I ever did was to choose that school. I met some people that became lifetime friends, actually. And in one case, a fellow by the name of Alex Mitchell, who was born and raised in Marin, he was a roommate of mine in college, and after he graduated, he got a job in San Francisco. And he felt he couldn't afford the cost of an apartment in San Francisco. Can you imagine that? Way back all those years, 60 years ago, that it was still expensive to live in San Francisco, although, of course, today we would think it was nothing. Anyway, he asked me if I would join him as his roommate in San Francisco, and I said, of course. I'd be delighted. I was very eager to get out of living at home and have a job. But we had the draft. Having been exempted when I was in college, I was no longer exempted. So 3 weeks after arriving in San Francisco, I was drafted. And I spent my 2 years in the Army. And I'd like to say that, frankly, it turned out very well for me. I didn't have to go to war. Of course, we were the peacetime Army at that point. It was between Korea and Vietnam. Um, and I met some great guys, wonderful men. I love those guys. They were wonderful. Unfortunately, they're all gone now. But they were a great support to me when I was in the service, and they were a lot of fun. Great guys. After the service, I came back to San Francisco, went back and started working with the Department of Employment. And I started out as a trainee. And I'm very happy to say that I spent 32 years, my first career, if you will. I enjoyed my time with them. It wasn't all fun, let me tell you, but it was challenging and I appreciated it. I spent a lot of time working with minority people, especially black people, a lot of Asians, some Hispanic. One of the things I remember with most pleasure was running a small youth office in the Fillmore. Even though I was the only white person essentially in the group, I was involved with a group called the Private Industry Council, which was in the 80s, I think. Well, it had to be the 80s, yeah, early 80s. And we had a function here, and it was a training program, primarily a training program for disadvantaged people. It wasn't just minorities, it could be anybody. And through that, I was very much involved with trying to help, what other word? Help disadvantaged people to make it in this society, which is very, very, very difficult. It was very difficult then. Now it's become especially difficult. I mean, I won't go into the politics of the moment, but it probably will come as no surprise to you that I am very much opposed to what is going on in Washington now. I find it despicable. There are not enough bad words to describe what's going on in Washington right now. And I'm so pleased that this church is strongly against all of that. And that's another reason why I love this church. But yeah, in that period of time, I spent not only my work time with it, but especially in the early days, I spent a lot of personal time. In that way, I felt that I was part, a very small part, of that whole civil rights movement. I felt very close to that at that time. But I was able to retire at the age of 60. Very lucky guy. And then I started a second career. And the second career was as a docent, a tour guide. I started with the city guides, and I used to do walking tours of downtown San Francisco, the financial district, Market Street, Rincon Center, and I did that for 22 years. When I was doing that, I also started as a docent in the Oakland Museum of California. I did that for 25 years, and then also while I was doing that, I became a docent at the wonderful old Victorian home on Franklin Street, the Haas Lilienthal home. So I did that until essentially the pandemic. I was, getting into my late 80s, and I was thinking, maybe it's time to stop. And the pandemic did it for me. and that was my second retirement. Now, along the way, I forgot to mention, I got married. I shouldn't forget that. God knows I shouldn't forget that, because it kind of almost saved my life in so many ways. I was quite elderly when I was 44, and it seemed quite clear to my friends and to me that I was going to be a lifetime bachelor. But I had an opportunity to take a position with the Department of Labor At that time, they had programs in the federal system where they would recruit people in the states. And of course, the Department of Labor oversees all of the employment programs in all of the 50 states. I took that opportunity. I needed a change. I needed a change from what I happened to be doing at the moment here in California. So I got back to Washington. And in the process, a young woman whom I knew through my family heard about that I was going to go to Washington. And she had been a roommate of my future wife. She wrote me and told me about my future wife. And she wrote to Kathy, my future wife, about this, quote, elderly gentleman, 44, remember, elderly gentleman who was going to be in Washington, and you have similar interests. I'll never forget that. You have similar interests. And she was right. I didn't know anybody in DC. So I called Kathy, and she agreed to go out with me, and that started a year of going to all the best restaurants in Washington and Virginia. And we traveled a little bit in Virginia, and it started to develop, and just before I had to come back to California, or I chose to come back to California, I gave her a ring. And I told her, come see me in California and decide if you really want to live there. And I said that really because she had a career going. She was a social worker in Alexandria, Virginia, and she was doing very, very well there, and she was moving up the ladder in that organization. And, you know, and she had friends there, she had family there, and I really wanted her to feel that she wanted to come, not only wanted me, but wanted to come. She did come out. She visited me that February of 1978. You know, we fell in love, and she agreed to marry me, and we were married in April of 1978. And we have now been married, and I find this remarkable, considering that I was already 44 years old when we married, for 47 years. 47 years. And she's become as much of San Franciscan as I have. I should mention that I have now been in San Francisco, or lived in San Francisco the better part of 65 years. I wonder how many people there are living in San Francisco who have actually lived here 65 years. And I've loved it all. I've loved San Francisco. Well, of course, it's changed. It's changed greatly. In many respects, I think for the better. It's a much, much prettier city than it was when I got here in 1957 and when I came back after the Army in 1960. We were full of gas stations and parking lots and auto shops. I mean, to think about where the Opera House is now, there were auto shops all that encircled the Opera House. If it isn't prettier now, I don't know what anybody would consider prettier. Now I will say that on the other hand, it is not as friendly as it was. We are much a bigger city now, with all of the, what shall I say, disadvantages of big metropolitan cities. People are busier, people are more abrupt, people are not as friendly. When I came here, it was like a big, small town. It's not that way anymore. So in that respect, that's a disadvantage. But in other ways, it's a much prettier city, a much more alive city. Now, let's get to Calvary. Well, I've been a member of Calvary Church as long as I think anybody now active in the church. In the early 1960s, as a young man, a bachelor, whatever you want to say, I felt a need, and I don't know how else to put this, but I felt a need to find a church home. I had not been exposed to church. I should have said this earlier, perhaps, but my father, indeed, was an atheist. And I had no training in the church. I had no involvement with the church as a child. Looking around San Francisco, I looked at the Methodist Church, I looked at the Unitarian Church, I looked at several other churches, even the Episcopal Church. And then I came upon Calvary. Actually, I found Old First first. And then that Old First, of course, heard about Calvary and heard about the wonderful music program. And it was a wonderful music program. It has continued to be a wonderful music program. It's probably the most appealing thing about the church over the years, with the exception of the ministers. And in 1963, when I first started coming here, our minister was Carl Howie, Dr. Howie. And I'm going to say it, I just fell in love with this man. He had been a chaplain in WW2, in World War II. And he was a man's man. I have to say that. And unfortunately, he did kind of turn off a lot of the younger women because he was so reserved and so intellectual that he didn't give off a sense of warmth from the pulpit. But the man could preach. Oh my God, he could preach. And that just captivated me, absolutely captivated me. And coming to church on Sunday morning was like going to a college lecture, a good college lecture. I got to know him because I became very active in the church very quickly. I became a deacon. I served on the session twice. And I had a lot of other little jobs. Now, your question, I'm sure, is what was it like in 1964 when I joined the church? Oh my, it was very different. Unfortunately, we're very formal, very reserved, very proper. I wouldn't think of attending church without a tie, a shirt and tie and a jacket. And I was the head of the ushers. To show you how formal it was, and we had, of course, large groups of people. In the 60s, everybody went to church. When the latecomers, and we had latecomers, we would hold them in the narthex behind closed doors until an appropriate time in the service when we'd open the doors and let them go in. And we would have ushers in the sanctuary who would then seat them. Very formal, very formal. However, the church was always active and always, in my experience, ecumenical, very ecumenical. We are ecumenical now, of course. We're active in the various organizations. And some examples of that were the fact that the pulpit was open to all kinds of people, including priests and members of other denominations and of course rabbis. And they would come and speak on either Sunday mornings or at other special times. One very famous time, and one that I still is so clear in my memory, is when the head of the Episcopal Church here in San Francisco, Northern California, his name was Pike, Bishop Pike, very controversial within the Episcopal Church, and generally controversial in all Christian faiths. He came and spoke on a Sunday morning and spoke against the virgin birth. And you can imagine the effect that had. It made the papers, of course, and made him even more controversial. But he did not believe in the virgin birth. And he made that very clear, and he did preach on that here in this sanctuary. Even this very conservative community was open about letting people be who they wanted to be whenever they wanted to be. However, there were a few who did not appreciate the extent of our ecumenism, because we had a priest, and I don't remember who he was, but he was a priest in one of our neighbors, I think from St. Dominic's, on a Good Friday. We used to recognize the 3 hours of Good Friday. We used to have a full choir would sing, and we would have people preaching the last words of Christ and all of that. And one of them was a priest. Well, this member of the church, and I have no idea who he was, but I still see him in my mind's eye, had a bagpipe. And you know, we are originally very Scottish. And he marched around the church that Friday, that Good Friday, blowing that bagpipe in opposition to that priest preaching in Calvary, this Presbyterian church, on a Good Friday. And I'll never forget that. And that, of course, made the press all over. And in fact, there were people who were gathered on Jackson and Fillmore watching this man go back and forth around the corner playing his bagpipe. So anyway, there were some really interesting moments. We had some very distinguished speakers. You know, being a member of Calvary, I've been thinking about this. I was thinking, why did I stay? Well, actually, I think originally, and before I was married, this was my home. Not only my church home, but was my real home. I felt welcomed here. I felt accepted. And of course, I got, as I've already said, got very much involved very quickly and did all of these other things. And another example of being welcome, and gosh, I almost forgot to mention this, is the period in the early 70s when, out of nowhere, we developed here in Calvary a dramatic society, we called it. A gentleman by the name of Charles Hennon. He convinced Dr. Young that we needed a theater group in this church. Well, that's what we got. He came and he gathered a group of us, and I was one of the first he gathered, because I've always had this idea in the back of my mind. I love theater, all theater, music theater, drama, all of it. And throughout my life, interestingly enough, from Pomona through the Army, through Calvary, and more recently, I have done a little theater. I've been involved with theater, very local, very amateurish, I'm sorry to say. But nonetheless, we got together and he gathered a group of people and he did a play in 1974, and I was in that first play that we did. It was a Thornton Wilder play, another wonderful, wonderful old member, Betty McDonald, bless her heart. She and I and two other, and I can't remember the other two people who were involved, I'm sorry, in the chapel lounge, just in the round, as they say in the theater. Anyway, they had seats all around, and we were in the middle, no staging, but four of us, and the play was a one-act play, a very simple play, a beautiful little play. And we did it right there. And that started it, and it grew and grew and grew, so that he was doing 3 plays a year by 1975, and serious theaters. Dr. Faustus, for God's sakes, Webster. And You Can't Take It With You. I was in both of those very small parts, and I had a bigger role with our dear friend, Karen Ward, but she was very active in the church, and she and I did a one-act play called Marriage Has Been Arranged, an English play. Charles was English and had done theater in England. I remember that. I don't know how he got here, and the curious thing is, by 1977, he was gone. And I have no idea what happened to him. But I never did know. I didn't know how he got here. I never knew how he got away. But his 3 or 4 years here at the church had a tremendous impact on the church. I mean, everybody was involved. The Pitts, Dorothy and her wonderful husband, Jim Pitt, were very much involved. They were social evenings. I mean, we would do the plays 3 nights, and people would be involved in preparing refreshments. There were people, greeters. I mean, he had everybody involved. It was an incredible, incredible time. But why did I stay? Why was I so involved? Well, it was because of things like that. I felt it was part of my life. And over and above, in a more religious sense, I do believe what the church believes. I believe in the teachings of Christ. I believe in hope. I believe in all of those things that we talk about every Sunday. I believe in them profoundly, actually. I believe in them profoundly. So that's why I stayed. I don't think this is too dramatic a word to use. I do feel blessed. I feel blessed in all of the phases of my life. They've been good about them. There's something good. Through some difficult times in the employment service, through some times when I felt somewhat lonely here in San Francisco, but the church was here. And I could always come back to the church. It's been a very good life. It's been a good life.